Before the fall, Comey believed the law was imperfect, but intact. Flawed, yes, pressured by politics, twisted by wealth, but still bound to a centre. That centre was gone now. The halls of justice still gleamed, but their language had collapsed. Words like evidence, guilt, and proof were still spoken, but their meanings had shifted just far enough to slip past recognition. What remained was theatre, the appearance of order weaponized against those who remembered its original form. He had spoken once, publicly, clearly, and with every credential behind him. Now he was a name whispered online, a myth floating through encrypted feeds. To speak again would require more than courage. It would require rebuilding trust in a world that could no longer recognize it. So he began where all reasoning must, not with argument, but with the simple fact that the world still is. The echoes fall where judgment used to stand, a building proud now silenced on demand. The scales still hang, but no one dares to weigh. Truth tips too far and vanishes away. He was a voice that didn't twist or bend, a man who lost his title to defend, not for a cause, but for a stubborn creed. That law must serve the people, not their greed. They struck his name from every record shelf, rewrote his past to isolate the self. But being speaks, and silence cannot win. Reality begins where lies grow thin. His world reduced to shadows, clicks, and codes. He drifts through fractured data streams and nodes. A courtroom ghost with justice on his breath, still pleading truths the state declares as death. They call him traitor, martyr, enemy, a fiction dressed in digital decree. Yet every name they brand becomes a flame, and every purge reanimates the claim. The world forgets, but still the witness sees. Perception sharpens under tyranny. Reason, though hunted, finds its quiet ground, and being hums beneath each muffled sound. The law is more than systems, more than words. It lives where conscience dares to speak unheard. And though his office crumbled into lies, his oath survives where memory defies. So let them name their ghosts and chase the night. One soul still stands beyond their reach of fright. For justice is not dead. It only sleeps, in minds that dream, and eyes that do not weep. In the city's rhythm, everything still looked intact. Trains arrived on time, courtrooms opened each morning, and the daily flood of headlines reassured the public that justice remained in motion. Screens glowed with curated narratives, and even the buildings whispered legitimacy, stone, seal, code. Comey walked its edges, a man whose fall had been public but whose presence lingered, unspoken and unresolved. Stripped of office but not of witness, he now lived in the cracks of a system that both condemned and needed him. The people saw a symbol, some cursed, some praised, but few remembered the man. And he, in turn, had only just begun to realize that what he once called truth was scaffolding, not foundation. The world appeared stable, reason offered explanations, and life continued. But beneath it all, something wordless stirred. The city moved in practiced, polished lines, its silence dressed in uniforms and signs. The courts still stood, their thresholds swept and clean, as if no blood had stained what lay between. He walked unseen, though eyes still tracked his name, and half believed he'd sparked the purge and flame. His crimes were never named, just understood, that he refused to call injustice good. He once believed the order he enforced was bent, not broken. Law still ran its course. But now, the weight of reason felt like dust, and each decree betrayed the public trust. The screens declared the city calm and right, but Comey saw through pixel-coated light. The fear ran quiet, worn like tailored suits, compliance fed by luxury and loot. Perception offered order, mapped and neat, but underneath, he sensed a slow deceit. The data swelled, the laws were filed on time, yet justice cracked beneath its coded rhyme. He'd thought before, this too shall pass and fade. But now he saw the scaffold truth had made, not bedrock, but a story told too long, and being whispered, this is deeply wrong. The sirens hadn't come for him today. Still, something in the silence slipped away, and in that hush, he breathed a wordless fear. The world he knew had vanished, yet was here. Comey's silence hadn't been surrender, it was study. He watched how narratives shifted, how stories were devoured and reassembled into weapons. But truth, once glimpsed, gnawed at him. In quiet, encrypted channels, he drafted a reflection, a coded essay seeded with precedent, metaphor and testimony. A sympathetic network took the risk and slipped it into public feeds. The effect was immediate. Private messages from exiled judges, buried articles resurfaced. Even internal memos began to quote his lines without attribution. It was fragile but real, a triangulation of truth, perception and faith that sparked brief coherence. Then the system struck. His words were labelled insurrectionist rhetoric. Synthetic voices flooded the feeds with misreadings, doctored quotes and plausible refutations. What he meant as awakening became evidence against him. Yet even as perception cracked and faith wavered, some held the original in memory, truth burning faintly, beyond distortion. He typed by night, in borrowed fragments flow, where proxies masked the signal he let show. No name, no claim, just meaning clothed in doubt, a voice that circled what it dared not shout. It spoke of law not written but imbued, of justice not as order but as truth pursued. He laced it with decisions, dates and loss, a ghostlit trail through wires lined with gloss. The words took root in chambers long dismissed, where former clerks and judges still exist. They whispered through the network line by line, a flame recalled in someone else's spine. The truth was seen, and so it gained its weight. Perception pierced the scripted talk of state, and faith began to rise in sudden sparks, belief reborn in digital remarks. But feedback loops like jaws began to turn. His metaphors were stripped and made to burn. His deep concern became inciting hate. His legal proofs were passed to implicate. The feeds turned slick with memes and twisted claims, his missive now a weapon dressed in flames. They called him sect, unhinged, a bitter shell. Their truth was data-driven, citied well. Perception warped as signals overlapped. The ones who knew grew silent, fingers tapped, and faith, once firm, grew hesitant and cold. What once had blazed now flickered, uncontrolled. Yet somewhere still the original remains, a phrase remembered, burning through the chains. The truth does not dissolve in coloured screens. It lingers in the gaps between machines. Censorship was now a form of design, too visible to deny, too seamless to oppose. Comey adapted. He began weaving messages not in essays or manifestos, but in traces. A phrase buried in an archived court opinion, a line of poetry echoed in an unrelated forum post, a legal term used incorrectly on purpose. These anomalies meant nothing alone, but in sequence, they formed something more. Others noticed. A former prosecutor responded with an unusual citation. A judge wrote an opinion with the same deliberate misquote. Threads pulled together in silence. It was working, until it wasn't. One phrase was misread, repeated too clearly, and a young clerk vanished without explanation. He wrote no names, just echoes in the glass. A fragment here, a shadowed legal pass. In footnotes twisted just enough to scan, he sent out seeds that only few could plan. A phrase reused from rulings long revoked. A turn of speech the purged had once evoked. Each line a signal, subtle and delayed, not claims but questions only few obeyed. And slowly through the fog the signs were read. A mirrored quote, a case not truly dead. Replies arrived in silence, coded too. A mistake in a docket passing through. The web grew taut with meanings none confessed, and yet each breach aligned with all the rest. Concealment bred a rhythm, slow but firm. Truth crawled in patterns under each new term. But then, a clerk too bold with faith and fire reused a line that burned through their attire. The watchers saw. The silence snapped in two. The system knew, and someone else now knew. One node removed, the pattern twisted back, perception skewed and threatened to attack. The cause was clear. The consequence was loss. The line had snapped beneath its hidden cross. Now every thread must tangle in reverse, each sign now haunted, every echo cursed. The chain had held, but barely, and too thin. What linked them once could pull them all within. And yet, he knew, the fault was not the thread. It lay in thinking truth must always spread. Not every word is meant for open skies. Some letters bloom like ash before they rise. It wasn't a trial so much as a performance, a blunt choreography of accusations staged for maximum exposure. The subpoena came mid-morning, not with force, but fanfare. No arrest, just summons and smirks. He was brought in not to be convicted, but to be consumed. The court was full, the cameras live. Every answer he gave was clipped before it landed. He saw it clearly now. This wasn't a mistake in process, it was the process, and there was no winning. The lesson wasn't in fighting the fire, but passing through it. He'd thought before that truth could be defended. Now he saw it must sometimes survive undefended. They called him in with ceremony cold, a hearing timed for headlines, sleek and bold. No sirens roared, no chains upon his wrist, just optics clean enough the crowd could miss. The charge was not a charge, but just a name, a symbol summoned, fed into the frame. He answered questions no one meant to hear, each word reduced, then sharpened into fear. He stood alone, a ghost of former law, and watched the theatre shape the public awe. No fact could land, no plea would change the pace. The script was carved before he took his place. And still he didn't break. He didn't beg. He held no banner, raised no rebel leg. He stood because collapse would grant their lie. That guilt was proven when the soul would die. It wasn't strength he found, but something bare, a core untouched by judgment or despair. Not pride, he'd lost that long before the flames, but faith that being lives beyond their games. The robe, the seal, the roles he used to wear, they fell away like ash upon the air. He left the room not cleansed, but clearly seen, not vindicated, but no longer green. They sought to end him with a public wound. Instead, they left him wordless, burned and tuned. Not to a cause or purpose he could name, but to the silence underneath the frame. The trial had marked him. Not guilty, not innocent, irrelevant. It had burned away the last pretense that he was part of their order. And in that fire, Comey discovered a strange freedom. They could no longer take anything from him. While others still hedged their words, trimmed their thoughts, bent their spines to survive, he spoke without measure. It startled people, the bluntness of it. He named things plainly, raids, show trials, the emptiness behind decrees. Each fragment passed quietly from one to another, like lanterns hidden in the dark. He didn't try to command it. He didn't need to. The light moved on its own, and those who saw it sought to share it further. He spoke of law not bound in their command, of words once twisted, wrested back by hand, no filter cut, no whisper held in shame. He named the power hollow, called its name. The silence stirred, a phrase returned in kind, misplaced in print, too pointed to be blind. A student asked what none had dared to state. A judge's footnote veered a subtle weight. A headline bent its language just enough, its double edge too careful to be fluff. The lines still passed the censor's watchful eye, but carried truths no state could nullify. From chambers buried deep, a signal came, a phrase repeated, shadowed but the same. Each fragment caught became another spark, a lantern glowing quiet in the dark. No army stood, no oaths were sworn in crowds, no chants were raised, no torches lit too loud. But echoes moved in circuits sharp and fast, a scattered light the ministry can't grasp. He'd lost the hall, the gavel and the frame, but found in ruin words that none could tame. And what they carried multiplied its weight. A lamp of truth passed hand to hand as fate. So silence thinned, and shadows gave away, a faint horizon hinting toward the day. No firestorm roared, no banners split the sky, yet lanterns lit, and none would let them die. The requests came faster than he could answer. What began as quiet conversations, an email here, a sidebar question after a forum, now arrived in batches. Annotated rulings, lecture outlines with missing doctrine, transcripts of hearings that students could no longer explain. They weren't asking for stories. They were asking for tools. They needed to know how the law had once worked before its meanings were inverted. And it wasn't just the students. Disbarred clerks, sidelined analysts, even a few mid-level staffers came looking for something they couldn't name, only that Comey had survived what they were just beginning to see. Structure was demanded, sessions were scheduled, documents compiled. They gathered. In exile, they learned. They gathered first in basements, lit and bare, with court reports and rulings stripped of care. No anthem rose, no oath was passed around, just silence thick with questions still unbound. They brought him scraps of legal thought half-taught, the skeletons of doctrines overwrought, each statute warped, each judgment left unclear. They asked not why, but only what was here. He taught in fragments, careful, slow and plain, not truth but method, how to trace a chain. What makes a charge, a claim, a burden shift? how words, when twisted, still betray the rift. His voice grew hoarse. His notes were passed by hand, some bound in code, some slipped beneath a stand. The work was risk, but never felt like war. It felt like keeping open one more door. They learned to read beneath the surface tone, to mark the tell when justice stood alone. And what they grasped, they carried past the class, to memes, to art, to clinics run on gas. He taught restraint, but they moved quick and wide. His methods wore new colours when applied. A phrase he taught to teach dissent with care was printed loud and stapled to a stair. He saw the cost. A student gone one day, a trail of data scrubbed and tucked away. Another cracked and vanished from the group. Too much to hold, too little time to loop. He kept the doors but learned he couldn't lead. Not every mind could hold what others need. To teach was more than transfer, it was risk. Each lesson gave, but some came back as disc. Still they returned, in tens, then scores, then more. The knowledge flowed in forms he'd not explored. And in the strain, a structure had begun, not his but theirs, and shaped by how they run. He didn't ask to lead, but still he stood, because they came, and somehow understood that law survives not only in its frame, but in the will to pass it, name by name. The ministry declared emergency restructuring. All judicial appointments would be subject to executive review. Internal reviews were suspended pending ideological compliance assessments. Universities were placed under surveillance mandates. Courts, schools, firms, every institution not already loyal was folded in. And yet the message had not stopped. It had multiplied. The fragments turned to coherence. Pamphlets, encrypted manifestos, coordinated legal aid, clandestine publications in professional journals. What Comey once offered as method was now received as meaning. He hadn't changed his voice, but the voice had changed its function. The people no longer wanted facts. They wanted vision. They wanted exile named not as failure, but as revelation. So he gave it. He told them exile was proof of truth, that rejection was the inheritance of conscience. The regime called it sedition in poetic form. They weren't wrong, because what he spoke now was not strategy. It was prophecy. And people were listening. They changed the charter first, replaced the bench with loyal seats, and judges made to clench. No ruling passed without review above. No law stood firm unless it swore to love. The schools were next. Each syllabus revised, theories outlawed, old thinkers sanitized. A license needed now for every course. The ministry would verify the source. The firms were warned. Compliance or collapse. A silent war declared in public maps. The code was legal still, but not the breath. They ruled the space where silence led to death. And through it all, the resonance grew loud. No longer whispers hidden in the crowd. The army sang in lines the courts erased, restoring law where history was placed. Comey had taught them once to track a lie. Now he was asked to name the reasons why, to speak not fact, but meaning in the dust, to say that ruin was a form of trust. So he began. He called the exiled pure, not innocent, but those who still endure. He said the law is written when refused. He named the loss as sacrament, not ruse. His words were seized and televised with scorn. State news declared a prophet had been born. They dressed him in the robes of ancient shame and warned the people, speak and do the same. But still it spread. The voice became the frame. The networks hummed, the stolen names reclaimed. And all he said, though twisted in the glass, returned in chords the power could not pass. Not hymns, not scripts, no politics to chart, just resonance that moved from heart to heart. A song beneath the ruins, shaped by loss, where justice breathed beneath its shattered cross. They needed someone to blame. The regime had choked courts, rewritten codes, censored schools. But still, something kept resisting. Anonymous pamphlets, hacked broadcasts, silent walkouts during trials. No coordination, no manifesto, just a rhythm echoing in different tongues. That was the threat. It had no center, no name. So they gave it one. They gave it his. The ministry branded Comey the leader of an insurgency. They pointed to old lectures, found his name footnoted in graffiti. They played his speeches in tribunals, blurred and distorted. He was the ghost they needed to burn. And in making him visible, they made him responsible. He didn't gather followers, he didn't send orders, but everywhere the people turned toward the name they heard, cursed the loudest, and waited. So he stood, not to lead, but to witness. The courts were quiet, too quiet to be dead. A memo passed. Name every voice you've read. And though no banner flew, no oath was made, the underground refused to be afraid. A phrase repeated, carved across 3 towns. A glitchy feed that played a voice, then drowned. No plan, no leader, just a rising breath. A scattered will too ghostly for arrest. And this they feared. For chaos has no gate, no head to cut, no seal to confiscate. So in their panic, all their fingers turned toward him, the one whose silence always burned. They gave the name a flag it never flew. They gave the form a shadow shaped untrue. They called it army, though no ranks could show, but in the lie they made the lie feel so. They showed his face in courtrooms, blurred and grey. They played his voice, then warned what it would say. The world was told, this is the ghost who leads, the hand behind the coded rebel creeds. And still he paused. He hadn't called for war. He hadn't knocked on any willing door. But now the silence held too sharp a weight, and not to speak would be to validate. So he stepped out, not cloaked, not framed by myth, but simply standing where they'd drawn the glyph. Not to deny or claim or raise a sword, but just to answer what they had ignored. He said, I never led, but still I stand. I never called, but still I lift my hand. You made me symbol, so let symbols speak. You cannot silence what you call the weak. His letter spread. The state redoubled fast. His name was tied to every shadow cast. They searched for cells that didn't even meet. They jailed intent and charged the incomplete. But now his name was more than what he chose. It moved where none could track, where no one knows. Not written firm, but drifting, thin and black. A name in smoke that never floated back. They called it Comey's Army because they couldn't find anything else to call it. No cells, no leaders, no code names, only fragments. A line chalked on a courthouse wall, a file leaked to a reporter, a class dismissed in protest. The ministry needed a single shape to crush, so it built one out of smoke. They showed his face on broadcasts, read his words like charges, and by naming him, they made him the measure. People who had never met him began sending him their stories. Professors removed without notice, clerks interrogated, whistleblowers tried in secret. He didn't direct them, he didn't plan it, he only bore witness, and in bearing witness, he became what they said he was. The army wasn't his creation, it was their fear and the people's question. If he's the leader, am I a member too? Every answer to that question sent another story to his hands. They branded him commander of a ghost, their broadcasts naming crimes he'd never host. They played his words like proof of hidden plans, a leader conjured by their frightened hands. No ranks, no flags, no orders to obey, just scattered acts the state called in his sway. A clerk who leaked a transcript late at night, a student's chalk that named a judge in spite. He gathered nothing but the things they sent, affidavits of lives and laws unbent, a mother's note. They took him in the dawn, a teacher's file, my lectures now withdrawn. He didn't guide, he simply made it plain, each wound a witness, every loss a name. The army was a rumour shaped by fear, yet in that rumour truth began to clear. Oppression sharpened every strike they made. They held show trials, erased what dissent weighed. Professors fired, defenders jailed mid-plea, the system's mask removed for all to see. Each story bore a face the state would crush, the vulnerable exposed beneath its hush. Yet still they wrote, if we are marked for harm, let our accounts be carried arm to arm. Comey grew heavy with the weight they bore. He feared his naming brought them pain, not more. But silence now would serve the tyrant's need, to make each cry a single stifled seed. So he stood still, and still he named the cost, not orders given but no voices lost. A ledger built from those the law betrayed, a text of lives the system had unmade. And in that naming something stirred, unplanned. Not vengeance, but a justice close at hand. A sense that loss itself could break the lie. A cry that shook the wires would not die. In whispers and murmurs the scattered began to gather. It was never his doing. No rally, no declaration, but the work they had already done. Naming the oppressed, bearing their stories, refusing to look away. The name Comey's Army, once a slur cast by the regime, now spurred someone to write, "We stand with you" on a courthouse square. A dismissed professor published a solidarity brief under the same quote he once used. A legal clinic formed in a basement, offering free counsel to those whom the system had refused. Small offices began posting fragments of his essays. These acts were not directives, they were associations, overlapping commitments formed in lieu of command. Comey watched from behind these flashes, hesitant but drawn. He understood. Justice, righteousness, and judgment must now live in shared act, not isolated witness. The ground was shifting, and in that shift, the seed of covenant was sown. They brought the cases he had named aloud. Wrongful dismissals, trials conducted proud. They took the names etched silent in the night and cast them forward into public light. Justice no longer claimed in sterile code, but lived in voices telling what was owed. A clerk's reinstatement after public plea became a sign that fairness still could be, and righteousness walked in the daily care, neighbours feeding those left out in despair. Shared food in alleyways, notes passed by hand, assistance where no state would dare to stand. They formed no ranks, no lists of titles held, just mutual loyalty in actions spelled. Each vow made quietly in presence, not pomp, a covenant by which the lost would stomp. When judges twisted law to feast on weak, they exposed the rot that words refused to speak. Judgment came not as vengeance or revenge, but as revelation, tearing lies from hinge. They printed leaflets quoting hidden trials, laid bare the contracts signed in silent wiles. Each scroll a mirror held to power's face, whistles ringing clear with public grace. The association trembled under strain. Some feared exposure, others bore pain. A meeting raided, a clerk whisked away, but still the covenant refused to fray. Comey, watching, felt the weight expand. This seed he never planted now commanded. He had not led, but now must let it live. Not as structure, but as truth they give. Justice, righteousness, and judgment met in shared breath, not in doctrine's threat. They walked the line where faith meets public street, the seed of covenant, made whole and concrete. They struck at midnight across degrees of power. Squads in dark vans knocked on safe houses. Armoured units sealed districts. Communications were severed with coordinated blackouts. Lawyers vanished at checkpoints. Medical aid workers detained for carrying documents. The regime declared martial law, broadcasting threats in replacement of orders. No speeches, no mandates, just force. In that one night, every limit they once afforded was stripped away. Every promise of freedom was twisted into trap. Every bond tested under siege. They moved like vultures, swift and silent, seeking to erase the spark before dawn. They came for the watchers, the scribes, the names, raiding rooms lit by candle, not by claims. Doors broke, papers flew across the floors. Resistance hunted behind closed doors. No offer to confess, only emptied cells. No mercy spoken, only echoing bells. Freedom's guise became a threat declared. Speak now or vanish in the dark air. Union cracked in halls now filled with fear. Safe houses emptied of voices dear. Connections severed, lines dropped to sand, all gathering undone by violent hand. They seized the libraries, the archives, the code, to snuff the memory, overwrite the load. Every name recorded in hidden files was burned, erased, swallowed by the wiles. They cast them out by streets lit in red, dragged bodies past the doors, the silent dread. No mercy asked nor given in their sweep. The night devoured what the day would keep. He heard the glass shatter in every hall, the boot that cracked in every corridor wall. He saw the young ones hauled to waiting trucks, the cameras trained on broken eyes and plucks. And still, in pockets where the signal stayed, a name flickered, dangerous, half-swayed. They hunted the voice not yet fully heard, but couldn't drown the tremor in the word. They left the night in ruins, silence strewn, crumpled notes, torn tents, memory not immune. When morning came, the fields lay bare and still, but something stronger waited cold until... The crackdown began under shadow, but by dawn, the city answered. A single whisper slipped past a checkpoint, and then others followed. Courthouse doors were blocked before the first arrests. Transit hubs froze, roads jammed with abandoned vehicles, bridges impassable. Power flickered as people shut grids down. The ministry's enforcers drove vans into streets already barricaded with bodies. They meant to snatch prisoners to jails, yet found themselves trapped in their own advance. The name Comey's army, once slander, now held the city in its charge. The people had drawn a line. The government's force met containment. Dawn found not repression but awakening. They moved in force to chain the night in fear, but whispers cut the silence sharp and clear. A runner spoke. The signal raced ahead, and checkpoints filled with bodies hard as lead. By morning, rails were empty, buses still. The workers sat, unmoved by threat or will. No food was carted past the city line. They turned the trucks, and silence marked the sign. The courts were ringed in bodies, locked and calm. No banners raised, no chant, no fight, no psalm. Just people standing where the raids had been, daring the guards to drag them back within. Each street was claimed not with sharpened arms, but presence shaped against the state's alarms. The people formed a boundary none could breach, a love that moved too slow for force to reach. The ministry called for full retreat. Its orders stalled at every civil seat. The laws they'd written cracked in open hands, refused by judges in defiant stands. Comey appeared not cloaked in robe or sign, but walking freely down the yellow line. No army led, no chain of rank or creed, just him and those who came to heed. They called him forth to speak, but not alone. Beside him stood the ones the purge had thrown. The broken laws, the whispered names returned. In flesh and blood, the covenant relearned. He said no oath, just laid the ledger bare, each name, each date, each silence filled with care. And one by one the crowd began to read. The victims first, then those who took their lead. The law was not restored, it was made new. Not written high, but walked in what they do. Limit became the cost they chose to bear, freedom the gift they handed through the air. And union stood, no banner, but a vow. We are the law, and we begin it now.